Hi, I'm Marc Sumner, CEO and founder of Robertson Sumner. Welcome to the Channel Chat podcast, where we will share learnings, best practices and failures with some of the biggest names in the IT industry. Hello, I'm Marc Sumner, host of the Channel Chat podcast show, and today I have the pleasure of having Raoul Monks, Managing Director of Flume Training in the house. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you very much, Mark, for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. And you got all right here without the coronavirus epic?
I had the easiest journey ever in my car. It was empty.
Great, yeah.
Yeah, it was
Fantastic.
One benefit of a bad situation.
Yeah, good. We'll touch on that later if we don't. We won't obviously bore the listeners all about that. But what was interesting in getting you into the Channel Chat podcast show was I have got so many messages about how can we improve training in the market and how can we improve training in the channel. And obviously running a training company, I thought you'd be a great guest to answer some of these. But before we go into that, I'm more interested in how you actually got into the industry yourself. So how did you kick off your career?
So I started in 2000 in sales. I moved through sales up the ranks, that normal progression up to sales leader, which I liked some bits of, disliked other bits of. And the bit I loved was coaching and developing the team, and I had a natural talent for that. So I moved into an L&D role, running the whole of the learning and development within events and media company called United Business Media. I had a really interesting epiphany after about 3 months, which was when my CEO asked me what difference I was making in my role. And I thought I was making tons of difference because everyone was giving me great feedback and the trainers great feedback that I was bringing in. Who asked you that? Your CEO? My CEO. It's a really scary question.
He really valued it. Was that terrible?
Really. They didn't buy into the fact that it was going to make any difference, but I was convinced it was going to. So I went out to all these people that I'd trained and had been trained from external companies I'd brought in and said, "What have you done with the training?" And they all looked at me, blank face, jaw dropped, and said nothing. It was just a nice day at the office. And I was kind of like, oh my God, I don't get this, because I love training. I do stuff with training, but I realised most people don't. And it isn't necessarily because they didn't want to, but it wasn't easy for them to, and they had their own habits and all of that. So I thought there's a gap in the market. Let's go and create a business, a sales training company that actually works and that we can prove drives revenues and drives KPIs and ROI. And that's why I created Flume. The other piece that kind of really drives me, which I love, is this belief that is behind everything we do, which is that the biggest mistake that salespeople make is they look at everything from their own perspective and not the clients. And when you look at how clients buy and how much it's changed, because it is dramatic, the change that the clients have been through. On average, there's 6.8 decision makers in every B2B decision. And it completely turns on its head what works and what doesn't work in sales. So this old school sales approach, which most companies, I'm not talking about the listeners here, but a lot of the companies we speak to start with, just isn't working for the client. So we've created ways to help teams adapt to today's buyer and prove the impact of the training they do through us, because ultimately we want to be working with companies in 10 years and helping them grow. And we know that's about having an impact on their sales team. So really proud of what we do now, but that's our philosophy.
So if you were going to give a bit of advice at the moment to salespeople out there, how has the buyer's persona changed? What do they view as now?
So the biggest, most significant change is the amount of decision makers. Let me just kind of paint a picture. So if you think of buyer persona, your average client, number one is they're focused on ROI. They have to prove everything they do, right? So that gives them much more pressure, which means that they're much more risk averse. They don't want to do something wrong. On average, 6.8 decision makers, which means they've got to sell on to 5.8 other people. And what that means, they need to be able to prove to those 5.8 other people that what they're going to buy is going to have a significant impact and solve the challenges. But also they have to, and this is so important, they have to create a real case for change. And what I mean by that is the biggest competitor that any of the listeners out there have got is the status quo. Whatever your clients used to is just easier for them to do, because inaction or inertia is much easier, quicker, and
if in
cheaper.
doubt, do now.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the old IBM thing. You don't get fired for buying IBM, and it's kind of the same thing now, right? So there's a big piece here where salespeople will often go out and pitch their products or just sell at someone, but actually the client's not in that place. They're thinking, I'm safe and okay where I am, so why on earth would I put my neck on the line and risk credibility, time and money, potentially my job, by shouting to my stakeholders internally who are scary and could sack me? Why would I do that if we're not in a problem at the moment? So the big shift is because of the 5.8 other people they have to sell on to. The case you need to build is a case for change, and that means giving them a compelling reason why what they're doing at the moment is not going to be a good thing for them, and giving them new ways to look at their challenges within their roles and new ways of solving them.
So how does a salesperson who's trying to identify these 5.8 people to speak to, how does he actually identify who's actually the stakeholders he should be speaking to? Or does he just pick one and think, actually, I'll try and educate that person?
Really interesting question. So there's a lot of research into this, and we're very much kind of fueled by all the research out there. So the original thought, and this is just the natural approach that I suppose people would have if you find out there's 6.8 people, let's talk to all of them and let's try and bespoke my solution to every single one. And actually,
different messaging to different people.
Yeah, and that's what I suppose is the obvious thing to do. But what came out of the research is a great book for any reader out there who hasn't read these, called The Challenger Sale, and there's a follow-on called The Challenger Customer, and it's written by two guys from CEB, who are a research company. They've recently been bought by Gartner. But the interesting thing on that is it said that if you try and bespoke to all of those 6.8 and say, hey, this is the message for you, this message for you, when they get around the metaphorical table and try and agree something, they've all got different reasons for wanting to do it at that point, because you've messaged in different ways, so they can never agree as to why they should do it, so end up actually not making a decision at all. What does work is understanding those 6.8 by speaking to the person, your main contact, and getting them to agree with you and understand what is the one common goal and challenge you can solve for the whole group, and position your pitch around that, because then when those people get around the table, they've got the same focus and the same objective and the same challenge they're focusing on. So it's about having a collective idea as to what that challenge is and positioning it around that. The other thing though I'd say is that there's a big piece here around working with advocates. So some people within businesses are going to be far better at selling on within their business than others. Like there's great salespeople within client businesses and there's really bad ones as well. And being able to identify the ones who can drive change and build consensus amongst that decision-making group is really important. And there's certain traits within client groups that you can look for to identify the right person, because there's no correlation, again, coming from the research, between the hierarchy of a person, CEO, MD, name it what you want, and their influence within their business, because they're still going to be going out to these other 5.8, whatever their position, and some of them have much louder influences than others, and it isn't about the position.
Yeah. Do you think there's, in my industry, the IT channel, there's a serious lack of training, which I don't know why, and this is why I want to educate some of the listeners today. Do you think, though, that the serious lack of training is down to boredom, actually going into the market and thinking, actually, most sales training is boring? To be honest with you, I've been on a lot of sales training courses, and honestly, I've been really, really bored. Not because I don't want to listen, but I'm actually just, it's almost like schoolroom training. I'm just listening to someone speak at me for 4 or 5 hours. I'm thinking, God, this is really important to listen. And then I don't actually do anything with the next day. Or is it a lack of understanding? Because a lot of people at the moment only start getting sales training when the fire started. I.e., numbers are down, let's go and train the sales guys and get a sales training or whatever it is. So why do you think that is in the market? Why is it almost like one of the last things to think about?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I think one is because, and I feel a bit odd saying this, but a lot of sales training just doesn't work. I've been on bad sales training before, not the stuff that I've run, but in terms of stuff that I've been on. And that talk at approach, it doesn't help people. Like, they turn off, they start feeling it's not relevant to me, it's different in my market. Yeah. Our belief is that actually, if you want someone to do something with the training afterwards, they've got to create it themselves. They've got to own it. They've got to be accountability. So the interactivity and the idea generation coming from the learner is really important. But I think also one of the big issues or things that stop people prioritizing it is the idea that it's, people kind of know it's important, but it never feels urgent. And what I mean by that is that because we often work on such short timescales in sales, we think, where are we going to be by the end of the month? We've got to drive our targets, or got to drive our revenues. Then you think, well, how important is sales training to that? Probably you're going to be thinking, well, there's other things we could do. We've got other priorities. If you think, I've got to be here by the end of the year, that's where the growth needs to come. And suddenly you think, how important and urgent is training? It suddenly becomes much more important. But the issue is our horizon isn't far enough back. We're so fast-paced today trying to solve this problem that we only focus on what feels urgent that day. And actually, if you look at growing to twice the size of the company in a year, how important is training? Really important, because the whole goal of training that works is to get your team making more money. So I think it's a perception thing because of the horizon. And I get that, because I was in that position myself when I was in sales, and it's very difficult to look past the next month.
In terms of, like, for salespeople now then who want to get engagement with net new customers, how are you advising your salespeople or training salespeople to get engagement with net new customers they've never spoken to before, i.e. not cold calling, trying to get some sort of other awareness?
Yeah, so it's something that's very much on our agenda, because obviously the way that we can interact with clients has changed because the way they buy has changed. One of the big significant things is they're inundated through different channels, from salespeople saying we're the best, we're the greatest. Interesting stat, 86% of B2B buyers don't see a big enough difference between one option and another to pay more for it, because everything sounds the same. It's all, we've got the best, we've got the newest, we've got the most innovative, and actually the next person who phones up, they're saying the same sort of thing. So standing out is really important. But what this does is it stops the client wanting to pick up the phone, which is pretty obvious because they've got so many other things to do. The biggest mistake people make with intros, in my opinion, whether it's through LinkedIn or whether it's through cold call, is that they focus on trying to sell their product in the intro. And unless someone is thinking, I want that product at first, then they're not going to want to prioritize the time. The shift has to be actually try and focus on selling the benefit to the client of that 10 minutes. What are they going to get out of that 10 minutes? It means they should prioritize it over every other one, and that meeting they're meant to be having and that client conversation they're meant to be having. What's going to make this 10 minutes worthwhile for them? And some of the stuff that we've got is the fact that you speak to tons of other people like them. And the only thing your client wants to know is, how on earth do I make better decisions? How do I do stuff safely? How do I avoid these challenges? How do I avoid these mistakes? If we can position ourselves as salespeople as the people who help them to do their job better, and they can get real value out of that conversation, they're probably going to give you 10 minutes, and that's the way in. But the mistake is trying to go too far down the funnel straight away and say, buy this, we do this, and they're not caring about it. They're just thinking about that 10 minutes.
Yeah, so tell and sell techniques gone now. No one's listening to that. There's just no one's interested in being told and sold to at the same time. Yeah,
there's far less interest in that. I think that get someone at the right point with the right trigger, and they're like, oh my god, I need something, and you can be clever about this. I mean, finding out about the clients you've had the biggest impact with, and think back to when you started the relationship and why did they need you at that time, helps you identify trigger points. And then if you can go out and find other people with those trigger points, whether it's a new product or whether it's a new CEO who's come in or whether it's just got investment, you can go to them and genuinely say, we work brilliantly with companies like you. What we do is to help you do X, Y, and Z. And you talk about the impacts, and you can get them at the right time. So it can be that kind of going in and telling them, but it needs to be at the right time and for the right reasons.
So you said about getting that 10 minutes of conversation where you can educate those people or those decision makers on, you're dealing with similar companies and you can advise them. How do you get in front of them? How do you get those 10 minutes? Because it's still actually difficult even convincing. If you called me up and said, I want 10 minutes with you, Mark, I'd be like, no.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you convince me to actually get even the conversation going?
So I think there's a piece here around trust. It's a pretty obvious thing, but if you go to a bit of the research again, so there's some really compelling research around what works in sales today. Okay, so there's this book I mentioned before called The Challenger Sale, and a lot of the listeners might have seen this or come across this before, but it talks about different profiles of salespeople and what's working and what's not. So really, really quickly, it will answer your question, but really quickly, there's 5 types of profiles. And number 1 is relationship builder, loves being liked, gives clients tons of time, always happy, and just kind of shares as much knowledge as they can, but it's much more around kind of relationships, rapport. Number 2 is a problem solver, very detail orientated, very analytical, make sure that their current clients have no issues, so more of a customer relationship manager in salesperson's clothing. The 3rd one is a lone wolf, gut instinct, does it their own way, lack of process, often a bit of a nightmare to manage. The 4th one is the hard worker, bangs out the calls, bangs out the emails, all about volume. And the 5th one is the challenger. The challenger is the person who positions themselves as though they're the client and thinks, well, what does this client want to achieve? And they think about that client in their role, not the relationship builder who thinks about them outside their role and just getting on with them. It's a salesperson who thinks, well, what does this client need to achieve? What mistakes are they probably making? What challenges they have? How can I help him or her get results? Because I know if I help him or her get results, they're going to be able to buy off me. And so it forms much more of a teaching position where the salesperson will go in and educate on new ideas and perspectives, which is the number one thing from the research that clients want from the sales experience, is new ideas and perspectives around how to see things, how to solve problems. So the more you can position yourselves as kind of another cliche term, but like a trusted advisor, and we work with people like you, and I can share with you what works and what doesn't work, and I've got a stance, I've got a perspective, and I'm kind of win-win. I know if you win, I win. And going in and kind of very authentically positioning yourself as someone who can genuinely do that. But it means that for a lot of salespeople and a lot of teams out there and companies, they need to kind of reposition the way that they're positioning themselves and not be scared to be upfront and say, this is why we exist in your life, Mr.
Do you
Client.
think it's a really interesting point you said that, like everyone wants to be trusted advisors, right? It's not a new term, but it's a term that everyone's moving from. I'm not a salesperson, I'm a trusted advisor. But there's a serious lack of trust in salespeople when they even come in the door. So if you're coming to see me and you want to be a trusted advisor, I'm not even trusting what you're saying before you've even started. So how do you actually overcome that and build rapport and build trust with actually maybe I don't even know you?
So I think a big part of it is using vulnerability and authenticity in your statement. So as a quick example, so I recently won a piece of business, actually is back end of last year, and I always go to my clients after we win the business and say, look, why did you choose to work with us over the other people that you saw? The answer they gave was down to one comment I made. I hope there was other stuff I did as well, but this is the one thing they said. And they said, well, when you came in, one of the first things you talked about is that you want to be working with us in a much bigger capacity in 3 or 4 years. And that the way to make that happen is to make this work for us now. And I use that completely genuine statement.
It makes you sound like you're not just here for a quick buck and one deal.
You're motivated by the right thing. And I think that's the point, is that most clients don't believe salespeople are motivated by the right thing, which is to try and drive client results. And if we're not motivated by that, it's very difficult for the client to buy off us. So we talk about this thing at Flume called power statements, a bit of a cheesy phrase, but these are these statements of intent and motivation and purpose, which you upfront say very early on to a client. You say, this is why I exist. This is how I work. This is the biggest mistake I think people in your position make with my other clients. And you drive your beliefs and purpose and then you just prove it. But the thing is, we often think, well, the client will know this. They'll get it. And we never state it. State it up front and then prove it. And you're going to stand out from everyone else.
Because buyers are skeptical, aren't they, when they see anyone selling anything? And they, salespeople haven't got a good reputation. It's not seen as a profession in the UK. I don't think. In America, it's much more seen as a profession and a respected job. In the UK, it's almost like, I get told I'm a recruitment agency. It's almost like you're as bad an estate agency. So we're getting tarnished with the same brush all the time. How do you think, as a collective, we can change that persona?
I think point number one is to realise the importance of sales in terms of decision making. So when you look at how clients make decisions, there's 4 reasons. 1 is because you're cheapest. 2 is because you've got a better product. 3 is because of brand. And 4 is a sales experience. When you look at what's most important, based on the research, only 9% of why they choose is price. 19% is product. 19% is brand. 53% is down to the sales experience. 53% of why they're going to choose your product over someone else is down to the way that they're sold to, because what they're seeing or experiencing or not in that sales experience is the trust levels and believing that you're the partner to work with. You've all been sold to before and you've made decisions based on that salesperson. It's no different for your clients. So I think one of the things that we need to realize is the impact you can have with a sales experience, and you can't just rely on having a great product or a great promotional pack or a great PowerPoint. It's about the trust that you're offering to that client, and they need to feel like they're coming out having learned stuff, that they're confident in you. There's lots of different traits from kind of the strongest salespeople, but a massive one is kind of assertiveness and leading the client and helping them navigate decision making, because it's not easy. And when you look at kind of why individual clients make decisions, like the actual person you're speaking to, it's proven it's twice as likely that they will buy off you, advocate internally, advocate externally, pay a premium, and put you into consideration stage. All of those great things you want, is twice as likely they'll do that if they can see the personal value to them in their role of working with you. So we need to start realizing the impact we can have, because if you can connect with that individual, not as a person, well, yes, as a person, but not just as a person, but in their role, and help them look like a superstar, they're going to be braver and stronger at selling on. So being able to perfect and master the trade of sales has to happen for people to be successful. But I think the problem is most people in a lot of companies don't realize the impact salespeople actually have on the buyer.
How do you actually go about retraining those sales teams that are maybe ingrained in doing it one way, but you want to do another? Because that must be really, really hard if they're habitually doing it one way for years and years and years.
Okay, so there's a number of parts to this answer. Number one is that if you want someone who is so habitually doing something because they've been selling in a certain way for ages and it's been successful, the first thing that sales teams to shift out of that need to see is why that is going to cause them problems, or why that approach is currently actually creating issues for them. So the way that we do that, which is just so easy to actually do, is to hold up current approaches by the sales team and hold it up to a lens of the buyer based on how they now make decisions. So what we do is we get the sales teams thinking about how clients make decisions. We then share the research and we then say, this is what's working in sales. Where are you against it? And the team starts having an epiphany, thinking, oh my God, you've just answered so many questions that I didn't even know how to ask. But actually, it's that first bit is giving them a kind of a reason for change by holding the mirror up against what the client needs today. That's one part, looking at things through the client lens. But the other piece in terms of driving a habitual change, which is ultimately what training should be about, getting someone to come out and 4 months later be doing it habitually in a new way that's going to have more impact, is about accountability and ownership. So there's a stat in sales which transfers over into sales training. There's a stat in sales which is worth the listeners thinking about, which is that it's 10 times more likely a client will buy off you if they've been involved in co-creating a solution. And that's because of ownership. You push your own ideas, right? And you go away and you will try and get the other 5.8 to buy into your idea. But salespeople are there telling them, this is my idea, do this, do this. The client then doesn't own it. Get them to own it. And we do the same thing at Flume. We run workshops around certain areas of the buying and selling process and get the teams to own it. They create the approach, they own the approach. It always kind of leads to the templates we've got because we take them on that journey, but it's a creation, it's a co-creation, so they're much more likely to be accountable and go and do it. The other thing around accountability is we do a massive piece with sales leaders and with the teams to say, right, you're going to be coming back in 2 weeks' time for the next module, but we're going to be starting with what results have you got from the last one? Tell us what happened and why, and what have you learned? And so we hold them accountable for doing stuff, and we turn it much more into a project than just a training day. So it's quite embarrassing coming back 2 weeks later and saying, oh, I didn't actually have time to do that. It's like, well, actually, you did. You just didn't go and do it. And once they realise they're going to be accountable next time, and the leaders driving this habitual change when we're not there, the results skyrocket.
With regards to new business salespeople, there's a lot of companies now that are pushing brand, pushing marketing, pushing content creation out in the market to drive new business instead of actually getting an old-fashioned sales guy or sales girl to go out there and sell. Where do you see now the value of a new business salesperson when he actually goes to a meeting, i.e. the company already know maybe more about the product or service because they're doing the research, they're in the buying process before the new business salesperson comes there. So do you see that new business salesperson sort of changing now, or do you still see it as the value of that person turning up and I'm going to present you our product and services and you don't know anything about us?
Yeah, I think it's such a big question. So in theory, 57% of the decision's already made by the time they contact you, right? So they've looked into why they're choosing.
Where's the value of this guy turning or girl turning up?
Exactly. And so they're like, you turn up, you take them through all the stuff they already know because they've been on the website and got all of that stuff. What we talk about is the idea of, we have a very simple process which is built out of the buying process, which is the client first needs to decide why and how they're going to change. Then they need to decide what they're going to choose. Then they need to champion it within their business. So change, choose, champion. And what most salespeople go in with is the choose bit. Choose us, choose us.
Yeah, we're the best, choose us,
yeah.
We're great.
And what the client's hearing is you're the same as everyone else, and it's confusing. Like, I don't know how to make this decision. It's about teaching the client a criteria for change, how they should be changing. Because if you can give them kind of a supplier agnostic view of how they are going to best solve their problems, how they should be looking at the type of solution they're actually buying, and get them to agree, yeah, that is the type of thing I need to change into to solve my problems. And then you're just waving at them saying, hey, we're the only ones who do that. So it's this idea of kind of teaching them how to buy before telling them what to buy. And that's really powerful. We do the same thing at Flume. We go in and we talk to our clients, and it's very genuine, but it really worked. We talk to our clients not about our training, not about our courses, not about our consultancy. We go in and we teach them about how buyers have changed and what works in sales will never be the same. And let's look at where your teams are against what's working in the rest of the industry. So they realise, actually, I've got to develop my team in a way that creates these more trusted advisor, challenger types who are teaching clients and adding real value and taking control and all of that stuff. Because we know once they've bought into that, we haven't even mentioned Flume, but we're there going, that's kind of what we do.
What would you say if someone was very sceptical about what you said there and said, well, look, I'm in an industry, well, let's say there's resellers out in the market, that there's 10,000 resellers, not that much differentiation, potentially, because they're selling stuff, they're selling services, or they're selling kit. What would you say if they said, well, that's all well and good, but we're no different to anyone else?
I think one of the interesting things is realising the difference certain things you've got make to the clients. So actually often we focus on the big stuff and we think, well, we haven't got much differentiation. But actually there could be some potentially things that feel smaller to what you guys do. It might be a different process you've got. It might be stronger customer support. It might be whatever it is. But actually thinking about, for a client, what are the big impacts of not having this and what are the big impacts of having this? And building this case for why your differentiation is valuable. I think one of the mistakes is we're always thinking about the big things and we fire out the big things that we think we've got, and then it feels like we're no different. But actually just focusing on some of the smaller things that for a client, if they didn't have a company that worked like that, is going to have significant negative impacts, and starting to teach them around that can be a different way to think about it. So I think it's just shifting the size of what you're thinking is your differentiation and thinking more about the size of the impact or implication in the client's business of having it or not.
You mentioned earlier about referrals or advocates. People can actually say what a great job you've done for you, or you can refer you to another company. Now, I think most salespeople know that's a really good way of doing it, but they don't do it. They never ask for you to go and get a referral.
I know.
And they never ask to sort of say, oh, I've done a great job for you. Would you recommend anyone else? Why don't they do that, Raoul?
Right, so this is one of my favourite areas. I say that about a lot of areas, by the way. But
you said that every area.
I know. I just love every area. But the referral bit is huge, right? So there's a stat, and I won't get it exactly right, but that 92% of satisfied customers have said they would be comfortable and happy recommending and referring a salesperson to another company, but only 8% of salespeople ever ask.
Why is that? It's the easiest way to do new business. But they don't do it.
So
they'd rather do cold calling and do the painstaking stuff of trying to get a new company. And yet a happy customer can refer them to a new customer, and they don't do it.
Ultimately, the blame lies, in my opinion, with sales leaders, which sounds really harsh. But actually just realising that a warm call where you've been referred is so much more powerful, especially in today's industry where there's so much risk involved in making a decision. Who do you trust? You trust people that other people like you have worked with. And if someone can come to you and say, oh my God, this company was amazing, use them or speak to them, you're much more likely to do it than a cold call. So it's going to have a massive impact. But the reason why is because we're so used to being told to bang out the calls or just bang out the new business that we forget about the strength of certain types of contacts that we can make. And it is, without a shadow of a doubt, the most powerful approach you can use. We do it constantly at Flume. So we ask people that we work with, we ask people we lose business to, we ask people...
You ask people you lose business to?
Yeah.
Really?
We ask literally everyone, because the worst they can say is, no, I'm not telling you, I don't have anyone. But we give them a criteria for the types of companies you want to speak to and say, look, who do you know that we might be able to help? And we then have constructed different email chains that we send out to them. They can then send out to their clients, which then CCs us into their clients with a recommendation. And then we then start the conversation. And it's dramatically powerful, but we put it in as a strategy. And I think a lot of sales leaders and sales teams are just told make tons of calls or make loads of new conversations, and so it becomes much more on the idea of effectiveness in terms of outreach as opposed to efficiency, which is just numbers. So it's much less about volume for us. It's much more about thinking, right, who's going to be the best type of lead and how do we do it? So we're constantly thinking about, I suppose, how qualified those leads are and who's going to be furthest down the funnel.
Yeah, it's interesting because we get a lot of referrals, which is great. But I'll be honest with you, our sales team, and me included, we don't ask for referrals. We don't go and proactively ask any of our customers to go and refer us. Why? And I suppose, I don't know why we don't do that, because it is a more effective way of doing it. But I suppose it's just we're ingrained to sort of do the same old stuff that we've done before, unless someone educates you on to do something differently. Yeah. Even though we do get referrals, I don't proactively go and ask them. So
I'll tell you a cool thing. Sorry to interrupt, but I'll tell you a cool thing that we've just started doing is it's a referral, but it's more of a public referral. So what end of every single training course, because we normally have a very, very strong outcome, we will shout out to everyone we've trained. We're like, right, guys, follow us on LinkedIn, because we do tons of blogs and tons of stuff to help people. But we then say, look, if any of you guys have really enjoyed this, and everyone's normally nodding and saying we did and had a great day and we're going to use this and it's had an impact, we say, can you just shout about it and tag us in there? And so we've got like 7 or 8 people every single session saying, it was amazing with Flume, it's made me this much money, it was great, I would advocate for these people. And so we will go out and ask people to, and they do it because they've had a good experience with you. So anyone that you have a relationship where you think actually this has worked for them, just don't be scared about asking, because most people are decent and they will try and help.
Yeah, fantastic. I want to move on to sort of social selling versus old school techniques. And again, this is very much a hot topic in our market at the moment, where some of the leaders are resistant to letting people do social selling because they just think they're just tapping on social media and not doing anything. What's your view on it at the moment? How can we actually educate sales teams for maybe look at old school techniques and doing new school techniques, or a mixture of the both, or what's your view in general on social selling?
Yeah, well, I think it is a mixture of the both. So I'll explain what I mean by that. I think that social selling, the issue with social selling is that a lot of people, again, don't realise what they're trying to do with that first connection. So when you're first trying to connect with the person you've just linked in with and you're sending them a message, what you're trying to do with that message is you're trying to get them to just in some way say yes to having some sort of interaction with you. And what we tend to do with social selling is we go in and we try and sell what we've got. But again, it comes back to selling the value to that client of responding. They need to feel like they're going to get something out of it. They need to feel chosen. Like, think about all of the emails you get on LinkedIn or the messages you get on LinkedIn where you know they've sent out to 15,000 other people.
It's embarrassing, isn't it?
It's weird. It just makes you feel like it has completely the wrong impact. What you want to feel is someone's taken a bit of time to choose you. They realise you might have a trigger that's right. That actually they realise that they can trust you because you're motivated by the right thing, so you've got credible calls, and that they're going to get real value out of the interaction, and you need to make it easy for them to respond with either just a yes or no, or a click here, or I would just want 2 minutes of your time, but being kind of authentic and upfront, and realising that with social selling, you're not just trying to sell everything you've got. You're just trying to get that person to interact, because that then leads, and this is why I was saying it's a merger of old school and new school, that then leads to the call. That's the purpose of it, to drive a call and potentially a meeting depending on how your sales process works. But I think people often with social selling just think, well, I can essentially just send out all my information, and if they're interested, they'll get back to me.
Do you think that's because, we've come from a background where we've been told to sort of, and let's not call it social selling, but old school techniques, bang out loads of calls, numbers, and we'll hopefully get a hit. Whereas social selling, you've almost advocated that it's almost like you've got to take your time, you've got to find a trigger in that message, you've got to make it sure that's individual, which does take a lot of time if you're going to make it very bespoke to that individual. It takes much more time to be able to get that one call, doesn't it?
It does, but there are techniques to really speed and ramp that up. So you mentioned the idea like buyer personas earlier, right? So one of the biggest and quickest things you can do to drive your sales team is to think about the 3 or 4 most common buyer personas and create buyer personas based on 4 main things. So based on number 1 is thinking about what does that buyer persona do in their role, their kind of everyday role. It allows you to start realizing, it sounds really patronizing, but they're a real human and actually they're really busy, like this is what their role is. Number 2, you think about what results are they likely to want to drive in their role and what language would they use. That allows you to tailor to the impacts that they want to have and the impacts you can help them have. Number 3 is think about the challenges they're likely to have in their role that you can potentially solve, and what language would they use to talk about those challenges, because that gives you a way to go in and say, hey, you might be facing these challenges, other people in your role are, I can help you with those things. And the last one is thinking about how they're likely to make decisions, who they're likely to have to involve. By doing a buyer persona like that for every single one, it allows you then to create buyer persona focused emails. So what I mean by that is, if you know that IT director that you're contacting over here is likely to be focused on these priorities and results and is likely to be struggling with these challenges, it allows you to construct an email for the buyer persona. And you might spend 1 or 2 minutes just bespoking it a little bit, but we're not talking about hours. We're talking about 1 or 2 minutes to drive a multi-million-pound deal. It's probably worth taking that time.
In terms of training salespeople who want to have aspirations to go into leadership or management, I find a lot of people, candidates of ours, that are coming into us after they've been in sales 3 or 4 years, feeling that they've sort of got to the top of the tree of their industry. They're almost like thinking, well, I've been in sales 4 or 5 years, I want to move them to the next career path, and they see it as changing jobs, i.e. go into the management, still in sales, but sales management. They don't see it as to continue in the sales career, to be a super salesperson. Why do you think that is, and why do you think we actually then don't train salespeople to move into management, which really is a different job.
It is, and I think one of the biggest mistakes with sales leadership is exactly what you've just said, that we do promote into sales leadership from the strongest salespeople. And when you think about what a strong leader needs to be able to do, they need to be able to coach and teach and educate and support. They need to be able to plan. They need to be able to be motivating. And it's much more collaborative as well. Like, you've got to be a good team player. If you just think about those different traits I've just fired out there and then think, well, what's the definition of a strong salesperson? It's probably very self-driven and assertive. Yeah. It's probably
not the best planners, are they, half the time?
I'm shocking, you know. I'm absolutely terrible at planning because I'm much more of a...
Are you a good salesperson, though?
I'm a very strong salesperson.
That's debatable now.
For the sales leadership bit, it wasn't so much for me. But I was a good coach, and that's why I moved into what I did. But there was no... That career path for me was never there. I kind of created it myself because I saw that there's an option. I was very, very lucky there. But I went through the same path you've talked about, and I really, really wasn't the strongest sales leader. But I was a very strong salesperson, but there was nowhere to go. And that's the problem, that there was no path. And I think if you go back to the leadership of companies, creating paths where you can be as proud, and this is back to your point before, why in America are they proud to do it and not here? Because once you get to really good in sales, the only next step is leadership. And so sales is like...
It's wrong though, isn't it? It's so wrong.
You mentioned super salespeople. I love that. Like, create this path for salespeople and this path for leadership. And you're much more likely to be, I suppose... You're not going to lose the great salespeople because they're moved into leaders and then they get frustrated and annoyed and they leave and they don't really perform very well. You're going to have over-performance on the sales side, but you're going to have this amazing leadership team here who are actually behaving in the right way to drive the right behaviours here for the sales team.
Do you think there's even sales training? Well, hopefully you can solve this problem with your company, but do you think there's actually sales training out there that when someone's really at that elite level, they're all coming up to that elite level being a salesperson, and they really want to be that super salesperson, is there training bespoke out there to make them really, really good? I.e., because there's a lot of, what I find is that in our industry, we're getting graduates in, we train them really well so they're competent and they can sell and they can get on the phone and engage. And after a couple of years, you obviously get your customers and you learn on the job.
Yeah.
But doesn't seem to be much training for experienced or really, really good salespersons to take it onto the next level.
So what we do, and I can only really speak for us, and I'm sure other training companies might do this a different way, but we have 2 levels. So we have modular programs, which number one are a set of modular programs built to drive performance of all levels of sales teams. So we call it Sales Star, Sales Legend, Sales Guru, and there's 6 in each part, half-day modules. It's progressive, and we measure results, and the results are amazing. So that's kind of a way to drive progression in the sales team to get to super sales, okay? But what we also have is leadership programs, and the leadership programs are again built out of the belief, but there's 2 things. One is the belief that what works in sales is different today, so what works in sales leadership has actually changed as well. And so when you look at some of the research out of there in terms of sales leadership, coaching is core, pretty obvious, but also this idea of helping sales teams to unblock block deals is really significant, whereas the planning piece is important, but it's not as important as it kind of used to be. So it's kind of working with your teams, and we talk about this idea of sales leadership, knowing your purpose, knowing why you exist as a sales leader. And I think this really clarifies things for a lot of people when they think about sales leadership is, why do you exist as a sales leader? The only reason should be if you're going to help your teams make more money, right? That's it. That's why you should be existing, to help your teams make more money, help your teams overperform. If that was your core purpose, how would you be acting? You'd be coaching, you'd be training, you'd be teaching, you'd be driving. And it starts to give these behaviors over here as to how salespeople need to drive. But we run programs around that. How do you make that transition to sales leadership? But also, how do you define the behaviors of a strong sales leader? And how do you recruit for those people as well? So we kind of try to help people make that transition, but a big part of it is teaching the top leadership team actually what they should be looking for in the sales leaders to drive the performance from the sales teams.
And what would you say, what should they be looking for?
In terms of sales leadership?
Yeah.
Well, I think there's, obviously there's some fundamentals, like in terms of you need to be someone who's respected and you need to be knowledgeable and all of that sort of stuff. But I think a massive part of it is being able to one's lead by example, so not be scared to kind of go into the meetings yourself, be client focused, because ultimately if your goal is to help your team sell more, you need to know what's working in sales. So they need to be able to see what you're doing is working, and you need to be able to understand clients. So one is being quite client facing. Number 2 is the idea of coaching. So prioritizing consistently. And one of the mistakes people make with coaching in sales leadership is that they coach the underperformers, or they might share some time with the overperformers so they can feel like they've got involved in a really big deal. But actually, when you look at the research, that has very little impact in terms of the driving of results from the salespeople, the underperformers and the overperformers. What does have a significant impact is this idea of the core. Actually coaching the core, because you're going to have a much bigger impact from someone who's operating at like 50%, you can get 60%, than someone who's never going to get there because they're underperforming. So there's this piece around coaching, and the other big thing is this idea of unblocking block deals. And literally, as opposed to saying, where are you against target? Right, get there by next week. Where are you against target? Give them a bit of a slap on the wrist, get there by next week. Actually saying, where are you against target? And let's look at why that's happening. And from the client's perspective, what's stopping that deal here that's been in the pipeline for 4 months from actually moving? And let's brainstorm some ways to open it up, and setting milestones and accountability benchmarks for that salesperson to put stuff into place and making it easier for them to actually do their role. I think the final thing I'd say about leadership is realising the importance of intrinsic motivation as well. So there's a great book called Drive by a chap called Dan Pink. It's worth going on to Google, and you can type in Dan Pink Drive and you'll see a great little video which explains what I'm about to say. But he talks about the idea of just incentivising people through carrot and stick, if then rewards. If you do this, you get that money. If you bang out the calls, you get that money, or whatever it might be. If you make the revenue, you get that money. And he talks about that works for really basic tasks, but when you trying to get people to do something which is in any way creative or intelligent, which actually sales is today because the way clients buy has changed, that actually doesn't work. Because people need to be intrinsically motivated. They need to want to do stuff. If you just say, hey, if you do this, you're going to get that commission, what it does is it laser focuses the salesperson on the end bit, but not thinking about how to do it in the right way. Yeah. So in that book, which is awesome, it talks about purpose, autonomy, and mastery. So making sure that someone knows the purpose, what impact they're having, why what they do makes a difference. Autonomy, giving them some form of autonomy and ownership, an idea of making a contribution that they can kind of witness and see, so they feel like they're important enough. It doesn't mean you have to give them ownership of a whole product range, but it might just be a little project, so they feel like they're, again, kind of learning. But that links into the last one, mastery, which is that people like getting better and better and better at stuff, and that's kind of why we exist at Flume, is to help people do that. But if you think about it, and it's a great example you gave before, people get inductions, then they stop learning. What that means is they're getting no mastery. People aren't feeling like they're bettering and getting stronger. And I think realising that as a leadership team, that is so important to drive intrinsic motivation, because you're going to keep people in your business and you're not going to have to dangle so many carrots. And actually your job's just going to be easier because they're going to be more autonomous, is really important.
Do you think, carrying on that theme of leadership, I had a friend actually this week, I won't name who he is because I could get him in trouble with his current boss, but who joined a company, went to the first sales meeting, and the sales leader bawled out one of the salespeople and shouted at them, etc., and said, your numbers are down, this, that and the other, if you don't do this again, you're going to be an XYZ or put on a pip in front of other people.
Wow.
And wow. And my friend who just joined, they'd only been there sort of 2 or 3 days, actually went up to him and said, look, if you do that again in the meeting, even if it's not to me, I'm not going to be here tomorrow. There's no way you can conduct yourself like that.
Yeah.
Now, 5 or 6, 7 years ago, 10 years ago, that would have been acceptable, quite acceptable. I've been, 20 years ago when I got told off from my boss, I'd happily actually take a grilling. Why do you think people aren't accepting to take a grilling now? And this guy, who was my friend, his name's Alex, but it doesn't matter, but who actually wasn't even getting a grilling, was actually affected by someone else getting a grilling in front of his peers. That wouldn't have happened a few years ago, would it? Why is it so bad now for that to happen in front of your peers?
I think it's such a big situation. Like that's everywhere, and I wish it wasn't. And I think one of the answers, my core answer around that, is that the focus is wrong. So let me just explain what I mean by that. Sales leaders will often tell salespeople what to do, and they'll grill them and tell them off if they haven't achieved what they want to, and they say, "Go and achieve it," and they get aggressive and frustrated. The problem is the salesperson, and this is why I'd get annoyed if I was that salesperson, Alex, or whoever anonymously he is, or she, I don't know. But the reason I'd get annoyed is because the sales leader hasn't helped in any way. All they've said is, be better. But there's no, let me help you be better. Let me give you a way of doing it differently. Let's look at why it's not working. And sales leaders spend so much time dictating what. Clients have changed the way they buy, and so salespeople are thinking, yeah, but why aren't I getting those results, and how do I need to change? The problem that person's now got who's been grilled is they go off and they just try and volume bash out the calls, and we know that's not going to work for the client. So the reason I'd get frustrated is because I'll be thinking that's not fair, because you haven't given him any way to do it better. And that's what we need to do as sales leaders, is focus much more on why things are going to work and how the salesperson needs to behave to perform better, as opposed to just dictating what, because things are more complex in buying, which means what works in sales is different.
So if you're going to give a bit of advice to any owners of or MDs of companies out there who are skeptical about having training, what bit of advice would you actually give them to sort of say, look, this is what you should be doing in your sales teams now?
Well, I think I understand the skeptical nature, to be absolutely fair, and that's why I created the company we created, and the tagline is that sales training actually works and we can prove it, which is great. But I think the question is, look, if you believed sales training worked and could actually drive revenues by X amount and drive average order values and drive different KPIs, if you actually believed it could do that, would you prioritize sales training? And the answer is probably yes, because it's going to make money. So my thoughts are that, and I know this is quite an obvious thing to say, but focus on a company who can actually prove it works. What we do at Flume is we have a mechanism which is around understanding what good looks like. So we have a methodology, a benchmark created out of how people buy, and it's a benchmark which allows you to measure up, and it's on our website actually, flumetraining.com, and you can go and you can measure your performance and your behaviour of your sales team and where they are against what the strongest in the industry are at. But the reason we created the benchmark is then that allows us to diagnose where people are starting and where they end up. We've also created approaches which make it really easy for the sales team to embed and use this stuff. So it's really simple techniques which are massively powerful. So it's very much about making it easy to use after. But the other piece is this idea of, we call it game-changing content, but content which gets you into the head of today's buyer. And I think that's so important, because you can go out and find a great sales training company, but if they're selling old school training based on old school techniques, then it's not going to work for today's buyer. So sales training can work. It needs to be motivated by the right stuff, and our sales training at Flume is very much motivated by this idea of, well, if we were a sales director or a sales leader or an MD who wanted to buy sales training, what would we need it to do, and how would we prove that? And that's how we've created our company.
Again, so just to challenge what you said there, Raoul, I'll have MDs listening to this and thinking, well, if I could prove this to you, I'd use it. If you could prove it to me, yeah, I'd use it. But the only way you can prove it to me is if I actually buy it, isn't it? How can you prove it to me if I don't use it?
Great question, and I think what we can prove is not necessarily the impact we will have on you, but we can prove the impact we've had on other people and how we've got those. So we've got multiple case studies, we've got multiple testimonials, and every single one of those where we've got those, it's down to the relationship that we've had with the client and holding them accountable. So we actually choose clients that we work with as much as they choose us, because we don't want to work with someone who is going to say, actually, that didn't work for us in 3 months. And we've learned over 15,000 hours of training, which is what I've got. We've got a very experienced sales training team. We've learned the types of clients who are actually going to get the results. So it allows us to kind of pick a little bit, which sounds a bit harsh, but pick, because we don't believe there's any point in anyone doing training with us if it's not going to work. So one of the things we've done at Flume is we've actually started to look at the right sort of clients who are going to get the best output for us and for them, because we genuinely want to be working with the same clients in 5-6 years and then to have had amazing results and be doing more for us. So that means that we've got to get the right results for clients. And over the 15,000 hours of training I've done, and our sales training team, it's a very vast sales training team, we've started to realize what is going to make this stuff work in a client's business and what isn't. And a big part of that is the leadership team and this accountability piece and this ownership piece. And so we kind of go through that process. We as much vet our clients as they vet us, because we don't want to be delivering a service that isn't going to make you shed loads of money. So that's a really nice position that we're in. And it's only through years and years of kind of developing the business, but also being motivated by what I think is the right stuff, which is the client results, that allows us to do that.
Yeah, because again, I'm not knocking what you've said, but you know, I almost joke every time I see something about training. You know, those who can't do teach, those who can't do teach gym. And when I actually hear about, sorry to knock your industry, but sorry, when I hear that and I'm thinking, you know, yeah, I can prove it works. I've got case studies of other companies. I'm thinking, again, using that sort of buyer persona, can I believe that? Is it just friends of theirs, etc.? It's so hard to get that trust going with the customer. I think, actually, Raoul's a nice guy. Do I believe him? Yeah, I probably do believe him. Could he be using these sort of case studies? I don't know. I'm going to have to take a leap of faith. So almost, I think my point is, with most owners out there, they're still taking a massive, massive leap of faith to buy that sort of training on the basis that, is it going to work? I don't know if it's going to work.
So something that we've done, which I think would really help with what you've just said, because I totally and utterly get it. And we spend so much of our time trying to look at stuff from sales leaders' point of view and thinking what's going to make it easier for them or not to buy this sort of stuff. One of the really cool things we developed last year is this idea of creating programs around KPIs. So what I mean by that, the listeners will probably know this, but 4 core KPIs which are going to drive sales velocity. So quicker deals, bigger deals, right? So the 4 KPIs are number of opportunities. If you get more opportunities, you're probably going to make more money. The second one is average order size. The third one is conversion rate. And you times those together and you divide it by the length of sale decision-making process, and you drive sales velocity. Work on any one of those 4 KPIs, you will drive sales velocity. What we've worked out is a way to connect that to the likes of Salesforce or any of the other CRM systems that we use to then measure and identify, and this is really clever, identify the people in the teams who actually need to drive certain KPIs. We then have a start point, and what we then do is we set a measure with the client and say, where do you want to get that to? And we make sure that's realistic, and we then drive programs specifically tailored to drive that KPI, and we measure it as we go through. And like I said before, we've got to make sure we've got a very strong connection with that client, they're doing stuff in the right way. But the impact of that is, and has been every time we've done it, so huge, because when we've got a client who says we want to measure this, we're like, okay, this is probably going to work. Because if they're going to measure it, they're going to be serious about embedding it and using it. So we do that, which it takes some of the risk out, because we can say we can measure it before, measure it after, we'll agree where you want to get to, and we then have a bit of skin in the game where we've got to get there. So again, that kind of shifts the conversation because we're very confident in the impacts we can have.
One of the bits of advice that I'd like to get you to give the listeners is when you've got a decision maker who's delaying a deal. So say, for instance, he said, I'm going to make a decision by February, and then he puts that to March, April, May. How do you get the decision maker to speed up the process or even make a decision so you actually get your sales guys actually shorten down that sales cycle?
Yeah, it's a biggie. So there's a number of different possible answers to this. Number one is these advocates I mentioned before. Make sure you're speaking to the right people. So if you read a book I mentioned earlier called Challenge Your Customer, they talk about certain sets of buyers being very strong at driving change and building consensus, and certain sets of buyers being not very good. And like I said before, there's no correlation between hierarchy and not, but the strong ones are mobilizers. So these are people who can mobilize change in their business, and they're the people who educate other people. They're the people who are skeptical at first, but then put a business case together and think, oh my God, we've got to do this. They're the kind of project managers, the people who can kind of take control of those other decision-making groups. So number one is make sure that you know who the mobilizers are and who the likely blockers are, and try and identify if the person you're speaking to is a mobilizer, or the ineffective ones are called talkers, who are just people who give you loads of time but are ineffective in a decision-making group. So making sure you're speaking to the right person. If you're not, identifying who the most influential people in that 6.8 decision makers are.
Which is hard, isn't it, I suppose?
But it is. But the best way to do it is to use whoever you're speaking to. I don't mean use, but to work with whoever you're speaking to and get them to identify them. The other thing we do tons on is helping the clients we work with navigate that decision-making process with the client. So we always talk about the decision-making process in a client's business being, okay, first you've got to get the person you're speaking to be personally bought in and think there's personal value to me of buying this. I really want to do it. You're then working kind of together with them as a partner saying, I want to do this, you want to do that. The next bit is helping them identify what the decision-making process is and get them to step into the shoes or head of the other decision makers. Because if you can get them to think about John, Jeff, Ian, Betty and Sue, who are the other 5, and think, well, who's most influential? Who are the likely blockers? What do they all care about? What's that one collective goal we need to wrap this around? What could stop this going through? One of the most crucial questions we have to ask, but what most salespeople do is we jump straight to the end and we just say, is there anything I can do to help this go through? And your client doesn't have a clue because they haven't thought about the decision-making process, who's going to be involved in it, what the blockers are. And we just need to make sure we're having the right discussion to help them say, yes, I'm bought in. This is the decision-making process. This is my first step and when it's going to happen. And this is what the other people are likely to care about and what the pushback's going to be. get that conversation going, and it's much easier to help them navigate because you can start teaching them how to overcome those objections and like steam it through. But the other piece I'd also say is proposals. Lots of people who send proposals or follow-up emails about the costs and all of that, they make a massive mistake, which is that they write the proposal for the wrong person. They write the proposal for the person they've been speaking to. They don't write the proposal based on the questions the other 5.8 people are going to be having. And the questions the other 5.8 people are going to be asking is, well, why do we need to change from what we're doing? Why do we need to choose this one? And why is it going to work? And they just get this proposal saying this is 400 grand to get this new system. And they're thinking, what's wrong with our old system? There's no case for change because we've written it for the person who's already bought in. And so we make it very difficult for everyone else. They have questions, they push back, they don't prioritize it. And that's why it stalls. So making sure the proposal answers the right question and making sure you're working alongside the right person to identify blockages and brainstorm what's going to overcome them is a really great strategy.
My last question for you, if someone actually wants longevity in their sales career, how much learning should they be doing on a daily basis or a yearly basis or a weekly basis in self-development themselves, or actually taking courses such as yourselves?
Okay, so well, the obvious answer from me as a sales training company founder is do as much as you can, which is pretty obvious. But I would suggest the way to think about it is as a salesperson or as a sales leader trying to motivate your salespeople, a great approach is to position them. I talked about horizons before. Position them in a year's time or 6 months' time and say to them, look, what do you want to be able to put on your CV? What do you want to be able to say you've achieved? What do you want to be the champion of? What do you want to be known for? And they own that goal. What you then do is you break it down on a month-by-month basis and say, well, what would you need to have done and achieved in month 1? What do you need to have done and achieved in month 2? What it does is it starts to drive this intrinsic motivation, and it starts allowing a conversation with your sales team to say, I'm going to help you get there, but you've got to take on some of this self-learning. And it allows you to set these stage goals. What most sales leaders do is they just focus those goals on revenue and volume of calls, etc. But what I'm talking about here is the stuff that they're going to be proud of and setting it around that.
Yeah, great. Raoul, you've been a great guest. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Cheers. Thanks for joining us and listening to another episode of our Channel Chat podcast. If you've enjoyed what you've heard and are listening on iTunes, please could you give us a review and subscribe in order to get the newest episodes as soon as they're released. Otherwise, as always, we release an episode every Thursday at midday, so hopefully you can join us then.